Good morning, everybody. We're continuing our ongoing adventure in Oro Teshuvah Rav Kook, The Lights of Return. I want to return to a theme which was touched on, I guess it was yesterday, which is the impact of our behavior is much more impacting than we might think, right? We've talked about this many, many times, that when we do something, we do tshuva here in San Quentin. So, I wasn't supposed to reveal the location of the shiur. We do have the prisoner's cage over there. In any case,
that accounts for the 5,000 people listening.
Yes, all the yes, here broadcasting from death row in San Quentin. So we talked about the notion that like the Talmud says, when a person does tshuva, so forgiveness comes to him in the entire world. What do you mean to the entire world? I did tshuva. What's that have to do with somebody out there? Right. So we pointed out that because everything is totally interconnected and everything that we do impacts upon everybody else. So somebody in the shiur mentioned that it seems to contradict the idea of libertarianism. So and that made a lot of sense to me, because even though I'm far from knowledgeable about what libertarianism is, but just superficially, it seems to have this assumption that everybody should mind their own business and be allowed maximally to do whatever they want to do as long as it doesn't hurt anybody else. So that at first glance does seem to be a contradiction to the ideas we're discussing here, because the premise is not true. The premise is, because according to this approach, what we do, even if it superficially doesn't affect anybody else, it does affect everybody else. It affects the whole spiritual texture of the entire cosmos, everything that we do. There's no such thing as like kind of my own little sphere, the sphere of the individual. We're all intertwined, and everything affects everything else. Okay, so that was mentioned yesterday. So I got a letter, an email. There are actually people who do listen to this. Okay, there's another 5,000 out there on the other side of the bars. So so this particular person wrote an email that they actually consider themselves a libertarian, and that it was sort of jarring a little bit what was said. So I'll blame the person who raised the L word in class, not libertarianism. But it got me to think. It got me thinking. So I just wanted to, for a change. So I just wanted to share a few thoughts, and I'm very happy to hear what anybody else has to say, whether among in the walls of San Quentin or outside by email or death threats from phone calls, whatever. So the following thought occurred to me in thinking about this, that if I knew something more about libertarianism, maybe I'd be able to address this more intelligently. But I think that one could make a distinction, perhaps, between the philosophical or spiritual premises of libertarianism on the one hand, and kind of libertarianism as a practical approach on the other hand. So let me explain what I mean by that. So I think that the person that is physically present for the class who raised the L word here, libertarianism, so I think that was a very good observation, that from a philosophical, spiritual point of view, everything is interconnected. There's no such thing as, autonomy in the sense that, it's my own business. It doesn't hurt anybody else, right? From a spiritual point of view, that's not true. However, I wonder if you could say that on a political level, that a kind of political libertarianism doesn't contradict with this. Now, let's say what I mean. I've often thought about this in the context of when a society legislates certain issues which are moral issues, okay? Especially if it's a society which is not based upon the Torah, right? So let's say an Orthodox Jew runs the risk. If one advocates for legislation which is going to deal with a moral issue. So as long as the way the legislation is crafted happens to be in harmony with the view of the Torah of that issue, okay, so then everything works out okay. What happens if that particular society feels it has the right to legislate on moral issues, but it happens to legislate in a way which is not in accordance with the Torah? So then you're in trouble, right, as a Torah Jew. So I'll give you a controversial example, and then I'm going to change my phone number. So let's say the issue of abortion. That's a pretty tough issue. And I would even say abortion may not be the best example, just because abortion could theoretically be seen as since the whole premise of what we're talking about is an issue which is my own business, nobody else's. But if we consider abortion to be murder of another person, so then it's not really a good example because there's a victim, right, which is the fetus. So it may not be the best example, but for the purpose of our discussion, I think I'll be able to make the point even with a bad example. So the following thought has occurred to me. You know, there are discussions among Orthodox Jews in the United States about to what extent should the Orthodox community weigh in on the abortion issue in terms of public policy. Now, the Jewish attitude towards abortion is not liberal. A Jewish attitude towards abortion is that now it, like many things in Torah, it's not monolithic. You know, there's a whole, within the Torah world, there are different ways of understanding the sources. But one thing is very clear, and that is there are extreme circumstances when one is commanded to carry out an abortion. Okay, if there's a threat to the mother's life, that is unambiguous from the Torah's perspective, that the mother's life takes precedence over the fetus's life. Now, Rav Moshe Feinstein, one of the unbelievably authoritative decisors of Jewish law from the 20th century. I know it was a long time ago, 20th century. So he says explicitly that abortion is murder. But sometimes one is allowed to take a life. Okay, so you know, just an example in Torah law, right? Somebody is threatening your life, right? The famous case of Rodef, a pursuer, right? So somebody is threatening somebody else's life. You can kill that person. So that's killing. It's killing. No doubt about it, it's killing, but it's justified killing. There's also theoretically capital punishment in the Torah. It's also killing. It's also taking a life, but it's allowed if all the circumstances are met. Okay, so what would happen if, let's say, an approach? This is just completely theoretical. The American Congress passed a law that said abortion is not allowed under any circumstance. There are probably some Americans that think that way, I would imagine. Okay, that we have no right to take anybody else's life, no matter what. Okay, I'll bet there are people who think that. So once we say that we're going to empower a country to create legislation dealing with moral issues, then even though the Torah, it would be definitely sympathetic to a restrictive attitude towards abortion, but once you open up the Pandora's box, then you also run the risk of legislation which deals with abortion in a way which completely contradicts the Torah. In other words, can you imagine that it would be illegal, like the example I gave, illegal under any circumstances to have an abortion? Then according to the Torah, there are places where you're commanded to have an abortion. Circumstances where you're commanded to have an abortion, like if the mother's life is threatened. So then what do you do as a Torah Jew? So I can imagine an Orthodox perspective that would say, what are our options now? So we could say, okay, let's allow for legislation on these issues, but make sure that that legislation is harmonious with the Torah's viewpoint. That's one approach. Okay, I would say this is going way beyond my field of expertise, but maybe the Catholic Church thinks that, right? That it advocates for a restrictive policy on abortion, but in a way which is harmonious with a Catholic view of life. Okay, fine. Or I can imagine another person says, just forget about it. I'd rather have the government not get involved with this issue and let it be an issue of separation of church and state, and that it's be a decision of individuals based upon their conscience. Right. Now, that may not be the best example because, like I said, theoretically speaking, an argument can be made according to the Torah that it's not a personal issue; it's murder. So it's not so left up to your own conscience to murder somebody. So it's not necessarily the best example, but it makes the point I'm trying to make that you could sort of be a libertarian. This is the point I'm trying to make now. Can you imagine the following? Just help, and if this is not clear to you, just ask questions. That you could. So let me finish the thought, and then we'll open up for discussion. That a libertarian on a political level, that is, as a Torah Jew, okay, or someone who aspires to be a Torah Jew, that I'm better off, let's say, in America when the country, America, restricts or limits its legislating on moral issues, even though I believe that our moral decisions, even though they may look like the personal decisions, do impact upon everything else. But because I don't want the country to create laws which would contradict the Torah and force me as a Torah Jew to not be able to live a life as an individual in accordance with the Torah, I'd prefer the government not step into those areas at all, right? I mean, these are not attractive options, but it's the world we live in, right? Because on the one hand, by not legislating these areas, I'm allowing for wholesale immorality and all the impacts of global that could have. On the other hand, if I do legislate, I'm opening up the possibility of creating law which I can't live as a Jew anymore. Right? Those are very unsavory options. So I can imagine somebody approaching things from the point of view of Torah who would opt for the former, and that is, I would prefer that there not be legislation on these issues and allow for freedom of conscience, so that we can live as individuals in accordance with our own Torah view of life and not have the government interfere with that, even though it has the negative side, and that is that it will allow for behavior on a wholesale level, which is going to create very severe negative spiritual energy in the world and impacting upon the entire world. Because of the other possibility, which is that there could be legislation which would prevent me from living a Torah life faithful to my own values, which we believe are not just subjective, but are God's values. It's the truth. Okay, so that's just this thought occurred to me in kind of just thinking more deeply about, is libertarianism an impossible philosophy from a Torah perspective? So yes and no is the answer, right? I would say philosophically, I would say 100% that it's impossible, because the premise is impossible, right? That everybody, as long as it doesn't hurt everybody else, doesn't affect you. So why should you interfere in my business? So that premise is wrong from a Torah perspective. But on the other hand, it may be politically prudent on a practical level, just because I don't want to give the country the ability to be able to limit my ability to live as a Torah Jew. So yes, and speak real loud so that the lollipop can hear you.
So I'm wondering, it's quite a conundrum. So I'm wondering if,
that was good. Quite a conundrum. That was quite a alliteration too.
So I'm wondering if
quite a conundrum.
The way the law is now, freedom of choice, okay, in our country, goes along with that, because then the Jew says, well, okay, well, it's freedom of choice. So I choose not to do it. So I'm following Torah value. However, it still legislates, if you go with Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, murder. But on the other hand, if they change the law, which is a very political hot button right now, especially in the Republican Party, if they change the law to say pro-life, then that still, I think, goes against the Jewish Torah value. Potentially, because there is situations where
right
we can do it, unless they put in that clause in there under circumstances. certain circumstances.
Right. So of course, but that's a gamble, right? Because, and I mentioned that, right? It's a good question that if you could say, well, okay, let's allow for legislation in these moral issues, but make sure it harmonizes with the Torah point of view. Except for the Congress doesn't exactly say, oh, that Dr. Koff over there in Sacramento, Torah Jew, he wants the laws on abortion to be in accordance with the laws of Rav Moshe Feinstein. So we're actually going to just take the opinion of Rav Moshe Feinstein in Hebrew, and we're going to just put that as part of the laws of America, right? It's kind of unlikely that would happen. And so it's a risk. It's a risk.
So my third point is, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Is do we as Torah Jews say we're going to leave well enough alone?
Okay, so that's the other possibility, is to say, I'm so afraid that if the government legislates on these issues, that's going to make it impossible to live as a Torah Jew in this country. So I prefer they stay out of it altogether. And that would be like a practical libertarian, I guess is what I'm trying to say. That it might be hard to be a philosophical libertarian in a sort of a spiritual sense, but practically speaking, maybe that would be better for society when there's maximal freedom of choice, right? That allows me to live as a Torah Jew. So I don't have an answer to that, but I've just wanted to.
Don't anybody take anything out of context that's been said.
Right.
It's a good point for Ali.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you mentioned that, and it'll be the because I want to start the next thing, but I just want to, because I'm so glad you mentioned that. So this thought occurred to me. It was easy to discuss this in the context of American society, because even though we're in federal prison, that still I believe we're under the jurisdiction of the federal government here. So, but what about the state of Israel? So this is such a amazingly relevant issue in the state of Israel too. I'll give you an example. So there's a whole conversion issue in the state of Israel now. Should the official state-run rabbinate have a monopoly on the process of conversion in the state of Israel? Should conversions which take place outside of the official bureaucratic thing called the rabbinate, the rabbanut in Hebrew, should those be recognized in Israel for the purpose of, say, Israeli citizenship? So that there was just a Supreme Court decision in the state of Israel on this particular issue. Now, it's interesting. I'm not talking right now, though it would be relevant, but right now for today's discussion, just to make it easier, I'm not talking about non-Orthodox conversions, right, whether they should be recognized. That's a separate issue, and though relevant, but separate. But the case that went to the Israeli Supreme Court was a completely Orthodox. As a matter of fact, it was a conversion done in Bnei Brak by the rabbinical court of a Haredi court. It was a ultra-Orthodox court. So it's not as if like it was using lax rabbinical standards. It was a bureaucratic issue, right? That particular court in Bnei Brak is not under the auspices of the official Israeli rabbinate. And a woman had converted in that Beit Din and then wanted to become an Israeli citizen. And so the bureaucracy said, sorry, I don't care. You could be, Mrs. Lubavitcher Rebbe, you could be as pious, it doesn't matter, but you didn't convert according to within the bureaucracy of the Israeli rabbinate. So we're not going to recognize it. You can't become an Israeli citizen based upon that conversion. And then the Israeli Supreme Court said, as long as it was an Orthodox conversion, that's enough. And everybody's all upset, and they're upset for reason. I mean, here's arguments on both sides. Part of my problem is I tend to be fairly open-minded. May not look like it, but I can see arguments on both sides, and so it leaves you a little bit confused. I mean, just quickly, the arguments on the side of the Israeli government's position on this, or the rabbinate's decision on this, the official rabbinate, is that it opens up a Pandora's box, right? That once you say that conversions outside of the framework of the Israeli rabbinate are okay as long as they're Orthodox. Well, Orthodox is a big word, right? And also it's self-defined, right? You can get 3 rabbis who actually graduated from Orthodox institutions, but are really not too Orthodox in the way they look at the world and live their lives now. Plenty of people like that out there, right? And so they're going to do conversions, and also it can be lucrative. There are people who do things for money, corrupt. You know, that's, believe it's heartbreaking to think about, but give me enough money into the table, I'll convert you, right? Or it's the wife of a donor. I'm gonna look the other way and convert her because he's my donor, right? So all these things kind of happen. So, but isn't it better to have the process of conversion centralized under one roof, where there can be some kind of standardized standards? So that's an argument, right? There's also another argument, that is that you know, the state of Israel supposedly is supposed to be a Jewish state, and so shouldn't things be you know, the rabbinate represents a kind of philosophical statement that it's not like the United States where just everybody does whatever they want to do. It should be that we're now a nation, and the nation should have kind of a centralized leadership, etc. So I can hear arguments, but on the other hand, I can certainly hear an argument. A woman converted according to an ultra-Orthodox court, she lives an Orthodox life, and she's not considered to be Jewish for the purposes of becoming an Israeli citizen. That is a little crazy. So I'm just pointing out that the same exact issue now is in the state of Israel, right? Maybe Israel should say, and there are Orthodox Jews who say this. As a matter of fact, the ultra-Orthodox basically say, ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel aren't too thrilled about the rabbinate, the official rabbinate. They just do their own thing. And, you know, just because the chief rabbi of Israel, and I mean this with respect to the chief rabbi, or rabbis, you know, the ultra-Orthodox world doesn't say, ooh, the Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Israel said X. Ooh, no, I'm worried now. They just ignore it. Like, you know, they don't feel coerced or compelled by anything that the Israeli official rabbinate says. They live their lives as Orthodox Jews according to the Torah, and you know, don't pay much attention to the official Israeli rabbinate. That's why you have these Orthodox, like in Bnei Brak that I mentioned before, that do conversions, because they don't care. They don't care what the Israeli rabbinate, they don't feel compelled by it or limited by it. So the same question arises. Maybe it should be a kind of an extreme libertarian kind of approach, even in the state of Israel, that there should be separated of church and state, to use that expression, in the state of Israel as well. That, you know, the state of Israel is a secular state. It should deal with issues that are relevant to law and order and kind of the orderly running of a state. But when it comes to matters of conscience and spiritual lives, maybe that should be something which is purely on an individual, of not to be regulated by the state. So that's an issue which is very hard to know how to resolve that. And so thank you very much for raising that. So on those thoughts, we will close up today's discussion.
Do you have a libertarian neighbor or somebody who's like